The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Rideau Hall in Ottawa as Sergeant Mike Thompson adjusted his red tunic and checked his watch. It was 8:45 a.m. on a busy Saturday in July, and already he could see the first groups of tourists, gathering near the main gates. After 15 years serving as one of Canada's ceremonial guards, Mike had seen it all, but today would test even his legendary patience. The Canadian Grenadier Guards took their role seriously. Unlike their British counterparts who remained completely silent, the Canadian Guards were allowed to speak when necessary to maintain order and safety. This flexibility often proved essential when dealing with the thousands of visitors who came to see the changing of the guard ceremony each week. Mike's partner for the day was Corporal Sarah Chen, a relatively new addition to the ceremonial unit, but someone who had already proven herself capable of handling difficult situations with both firmness and professionalism. Sarah had joined the Guards after completing her regular military service, drawn by the opportunity to represent Canada's military heritage while serving in the nation's capital. As the morning progressed, the crowd began to thicken. Families with children, elderly couples with cameras, and groups of international tourists all gathered behind the designated barriers. The rope lines were clearly marked, and multiple signs in both English and French explained the rules for observing the ceremony. No crossing the barriers, no touching the guards, and absolutely no interfering with the ceremonial duties. Everything seemed normal until Mike noticed a group of young men in their 20s pushing through the crowd. They were loud, clearly having started their day early with some liquid courage, and seemed to think the entire ceremony was put on purely for their entertainment. The leader of the group, a tall guy wearing a baseball cap backwards and a tank top despite the formal nature of the occasion, was already making jokes about the Guards' uniforms. "Look at these toy soldiers," the man said loudly enough for everyone around to hear. "I bet they're not even real military, probably just actors dressed up for the tourists." Sarah maintained her position but exchanged a quick glance with Mike. Both guards had heard similar comments countless times before. Most visitors were respectful and genuinely interested in learning about Canadian military traditions, but there were always a few who seemed to think the ceremony was some kind of theme park attraction. The changing of the guard began promptly at 10 a.m. The precision movements, the coordinated marching, and the musical accompaniment created an atmosphere of dignity and respect that usually impressed even the most skeptical visitors. Mike and Sarah took their positions at the entrance to the main building, standing perfectly still in their traditional red tunics, white pith helmets, and polished black boots. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. Children pointed excitedly at the guards. Parents took photos from respectful distances, and the elderly visitors shared stories about their own military service or family members who had served. This was what Mike loved about the job, connecting people with their country's history and military traditions. But the group of rowdy tourists was getting bolder. They had moved closer to the barrier, and their comments were becoming more disruptive. Other visitors were starting to look uncomfortable, and Mike could see parents pulling their children away from the area where the young men were standing. The leader of the group suddenly decided he wanted a closer look at Mike's uniform. Without any warning, he ducked under the rope barrier and approached the guard's position. Sarah immediately turned her head slightly to track the man's movement, while Mike remained perfectly still, his training taking over. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said firmly but professionally. "You need to return to the designated viewing area immediately." The man laughed and turned to his friends. "Oh, she talks. I thought you guys were supposed to be silent like the British Guards. What's the point of being a guard if you're going to chat with everyone?" Mike had heard enough. While maintaining his ceremonial posture, he spoke in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the immediate area. "Sir, this is a formal, military ceremony honoring Canada's armed forces and our fallen soldiers. I'm asking you once to return to the proper viewing area and show the respect this ceremony deserves." But instead of complying, the tourist pulled out his phone and started recording, getting even closer to Mike's position. "This is perfect," he said to his friends. "I'm getting a reaction from the robot soldier. This is going on social media right now." The situation was escalating quickly, and Mike knew that other visitors were watching to see how the guards would handle the disruption. Children were staring, elderly veterans looked offended, and international tourists seemed confused by the lack of respect being shown to the ceremonial proceedings. Sarah took a step forward, her voice remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable tone of authority. "Sir, you are disrupting a formal military ceremony and making other visitors uncomfortable. If you cannot observe respectfully from the designated area, I will need to ask security to escort you from the premises." The man's friends were now encouraging him, laughing and recording with their own phones. "Come on, Brad! See if you can make her break character," one of them called out. "Touch the uniform or something." That was the moment Mike realized this situation was about to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. In all his years as a ceremonial guard, he had dealt with curious children, confused tourists, and even the occasional person with mental health issues. But he had never encountered such deliberate disrespect, combined with what appeared to be an intention to create some kind of viral video at the expense of Canadian military traditions. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people now stopping their own sightseeing to watch the confrontation unfold. Mike could feel the weight of representing not just the ceremonial guard unit, but the entire Canadian military. Every move he and Sarah made would be judged not just by the immediate crowd, but potentially by thousands of people online if these tourists followed through on their threat to post videos on social media. As Brad reached his hand toward Mike's uniform, clearly intending to touch it for the cameras, both guards knew that their years of training in de-escalation, crowd control, and maintaining dignity under pressure were about to be put to the ultimate test. The moment Brad's hand moved toward Mike's uniform, everything changed. Mike's voice cut through the morning air with military precision and unmistakable authority. "Do not touch the uniform." The command was delivered with such force and clarity that several nearby tourists jumped, and Brad's hand froze in midair. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Even Brad's friends stopped laughing as they realized they had pushed the situation beyond playful harassment into something far more serious. Mike's training kicked in completely now. 15 years of ceremonial duty had taught him exactly how to handle situations that threatened the dignity of the ceremony while maintaining his own professionalism. Sarah moved smoothly to Mike's left side, positioning herself so that she could address both the disruptive tourists and the growing crowd of onlookers. Her voice remained calm, but carried the same unmistakable authority as her partner's. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for this interruption to the ceremony. These guards represent the Canadian Armed Forces and deserve the same respect you would show to any member of our military." An elderly man in the crowd, wearing a veteran's pin on his jacket, stepped forward and spoke directly to Brad. "Son, I served in Korea, and my father served in both world wars. These young people are honoring that service. Show some respect." But Brad, now embarrassed in front of his friends and a crowd of strangers, doubled down on his behavior. "This is public property," he said loudly. "I have every right to be here, and these aren't real soldiers anyway. They're just dressed up for show." Mike's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "Sir, I am Sergeant Mike Thompson, Canadian Grenadier Guards, 15 years of active and ceremonial service. My partner is Corporal Sarah Chen, who served 2 tours overseas before joining the ceremonial unit. We are absolutely real soldiers, and this is absolutely a real military ceremony honoring real Canadian service members who made real sacrifices for this country." The crowd began to murmur approval, and several people started moving closer to show their support for the guards. A woman with 2 young children spoke up. "My kids came here to learn about Canadian history. You're ruining it for everyone." Brad's friends were now looking increasingly uncomfortable. What had started as what they thought would be a funny video was turning into a public relations disaster, with an entire crowd of tourists and local visitors turning against them. One of them, a shorter guy wearing sunglasses, tugged on Brad's arm. "Come on, man, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But Brad shook him off. "No way. I'm not backing down from these costume players." He pulled out his phone again and started recording, speaking directly into the camera. "I'm here at some Canadian military thing, and these fake soldiers are getting all bent out of shape because I got too close to their little show." Sarah had seen enough. She activated the small radio clipped to her belt and spoke quietly but clearly. "Security to main entrance, we need assistance with disruptive visitors." Then she addressed Brad directly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of military training and real-world experience. "Sir, you have exactly 30 seconds to return to the designated viewing area before security escorts you from the premises. This ceremony honors Canadian soldiers who died serving their country. Your behavior is disrespectful to their memory, disruptive to other visitors, and frankly embarrassing to watch." The crowd erupted in applause. A teenage girl near the front of the crowd shouted, "Yeah, show some respect." Other visitors began taking out their own phones, but instead of recording the guards' reactions, they were documenting Brad's behavior. Mike realized that this moment was becoming something larger than just dealing with one disruptive tourist. The crowd was rallying around the guards and what they represented. Children were asking their parents why the man was being mean to the soldiers. International tourists were shaking their heads in disapproval. Most importantly, Canadian visitors were stepping forward to defend their military traditions. An older woman wearing a maple leaf pin approached the barrier and spoke directly to Mike. "Sergeant, my grandson is deployed overseas right now. Thank you for what you do here. It means something to families like ours." Mike nodded respectfully while maintaining his ceremonial posture. "Ma'am, it's our honor to serve. Please give your grandson our thanks for his service." Brad was becoming increasingly agitated as he realized that instead of creating a viral video mocking the guards, he was creating a viral video showcasing his own disrespectful behavior toward Canadian military personnel. His friends were now actively trying to pull him away from the scene, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the situation. "This is ridiculous," Brad said, his voice now showing frustration rather than amusement. "All I did was try to get a closer look. Why is everyone freaking out?" Sarah stepped forward slightly, her voice carrying both patience and firmness. "Sir, there are clear barriers and posted signs explaining how to observe the ceremony respectfully. You chose to ignore those guidelines, disrupt other visitors' experience, and show disrespect to a military ceremony. That's why people are upset." Security. Personnel were now approaching from two different directions, their professional demeanor making it clear that this situation was about to be resolved one way or another. Mike could see relief on the faces of the other visitors, particularly the families with children who had been uncomfortable with the confrontation. The lead security officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a calm but serious expression, approached the group of tourists. "Gentlemen, I'm going to need to see some identification, and then I'll need you to come with me to discuss this situation." Brad's friends immediately started pulling out their IDs and apologizing, clearly wanting to cooperate and end the situation as quickly as possible. But Brad continued to argue. "This is harassment. All I did was try to take a closer look at their costumes." The security officer's expression didn't change, but his voice became noticeably firmer. "Sir, these are not costumes. These are the dress uniforms of the Canadian Armed Forces, worn by active-duty military personnel during official ceremonies. Your behavior has been disruptive and disrespectful, and it ends now." As the security team began to escort the group away from the ceremonial area, the crowd spontaneously began applauding the guards. Mike and Sarah maintained their professional composure, but both felt a surge of pride in seeing how the Canadian public had rallied to support them and the ceremony. they represented. The elderly veteran who had spoken earlier approached the barrier one more time. "Sergeant Corporal, you handled that beautifully. Professional, respectful, but firm when you needed to be. That's exactly how Canadian soldiers should represent themselves." As the disruption ended and the ceremony resumed, both guards knew that this incident would become part of their story, not just as individual soldiers, but as representatives of Canadian military tradition and values. As security escorted the disruptive tourists away from the ceremonial grounds, Mike and Sarah returned to their positions, but the atmosphere had completely changed. What had started as a routine Saturday morning ceremony had transformed into something much more meaningful. The crowd of visitors, which had grown significantly during the confrontation, was now buzzing with energy and a newfound appreciation for what they were witnessing. A young mother with a toddler in a stroller approached the barrier and spoke to Sarah. "Excuse me, Corporal, but could you tell my son what the ceremony means? After seeing how you handled that situation, I think he needs to understand why this is important." Sarah glanced at Mike, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. While maintaining her ceremonial posture, Sarah spoke in a clear, warm voice that carried to the nearby crowd. "The changing of the guard ceremony honors all Canadian soldiers who have served our country, including those who never came home. We stand here to remember their sacrifice and to show that Canada values the freedom they protected." The toddler, who couldn't have been more than 3 years old, looked up at Sarah with wide eyes and then turned to his mother. "Mommy, she's a real soldier like in my books?" His innocent question drew chuckles from the crowd and helped ease the tension that had built up during the earlier confrontation. Mike noticed that international tourists were now approaching other visitors, asking questions about Canadian military, history, and the significance of the ceremony. A group of Japanese tourists who had been taking photos throughout the incident approached an elderly Canadian man wearing a military veteran's cap. Through a translation app on their phone, they asked him to explain what had just happened. The veteran, whose name tag read Bill Morrison Korean War, seemed delighted to share his knowledge. "These guards represent something very important to us Canadians," he explained slowly so the translation app could keep up. "They remind us that freedom isn't free, and that young people are still willing to serve their country with honor and dignity." Meanwhile, the incident was already making its way onto social media, but not in the way Brad had intended. Several visitors had recorded the confrontation, and the videos showing the guards' professional response and the crowd's support were being shared with captions praising Canadian military personnel and criticizing disrespectful tourist behavior. Sarah noticed a teenage boy who had been watching intently throughout the entire incident. He was standing with what appeared to be his grandparents, and she could see him asking them questions in hushed tones. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak directly to her. "Ma'am, I'm thinking about joining the military after high school. Is it worth it?" His question was sincere and thoughtful, clearly influenced by what he had just witnessed. Mike fielded this one, his voice carrying both pride and honesty. "Son, military service isn't easy, but it's one of the most meaningful things you can do with your life. Whether you serve overseas or here at home in ceremonial duties, you're part of something bigger than yourself. You're protecting the values and freedoms that make Canada the country it is." The boy's grandfather, who had been listening carefully, extended his hand toward the barrier in a gesture of respect. "Sergeant, my father served at Vimy Ridge. I served in peacekeeping missions, and now maybe this young man will carry on the tradition. Thank you for showing him what military bearing looks like." As the formal ceremony continued, Mike reflected on how the morning's events had turned what could have been a negative incident into a powerful teaching moment. The disruptive tourists had inadvertently created an opportunity for the guards to demonstrate not just their training, but their values. They had shown that it was possible to be firm without being aggressive, professional without being cold, and proud without being arrogant. A group of university students who had been part of the crowd during the confrontation approached Sarah with notebooks in hand. "Excuse me, Corporal, we're journalism students from Carleton University. Would you be willing to talk to us about what just happened here? We think this story needs to be told." Sarah maintained her position but spoke clearly enough for all the students to hear. "The Canadian Armed Forces are always proud to engage with students and the media. However, we're currently on ceremonial duty. If you'd like to arrange an interview, please contact our public affairs office. They can put you in touch with the appropriate personnel to discuss both today's incident and the broader significance of ceremonial duties." One of the students, a young woman with short dark hair, continued writing notes while asking another question. "Can you tell us why it was important to respond the way you did, rather than just ignoring the disruption?" Mike answered this time, his response measured and thoughtful. When someone disrespects a military ceremony, they're not just disrespecting the guards standing here today. They're disrespecting every Canadian who has ever worn the uniform, including those who paid the ultimate price for their service. We have a responsibility to uphold the dignity of that sacrifice. The students nodded and continued taking notes, clearly understanding that they had witnessed something newsworthy. As they prepared to leave, the young woman who had asked the questions looked directly at both guards. "Thank you for your service, and thank you for handling that situation with such professionalism. You've given us a lot to think about." As the ceremony began to wind down, Mike noticed that the crowd was not dispersing as quickly as usual. Instead, people were lingering, taking more photos, asking more questions, and engaging with each other about what they had witnessed. Children were asking their parents about military service, teenagers were discussing the importance of respect and tradition, and international visitors were learning about Canadian values through the lens of this unexpected confrontation. Annie, elderly woman who had been watching quietly throughout the entire morning, approached the barrier one final time. She was carrying a small bouquet of flowers, and her eyes were moist with emotion. "Sergeants," she said softly, "my husband served in World War II and never came home. Every time I see young people like you honoring that service, it means everything to me. Thank you for not letting anyone make a mockery of what he died for." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat but maintained her composure as she responded. "Ma'am, it is our honor to serve in memory of heroes like your husband. Their sacrifice is the reason we stand here today." As the woman walked away, placing her flowers at the base of a nearby memorial, both guards realized that the morning's events had reminded everyone present, including themselves, of the deeper meaning behind the ceremony they performed every day. What had started as a confrontation with disrespectful tourists had become a powerful affirmation of the values and traditions they represented. Later that afternoon, Mike and Sarah were called into their commanding officer's office. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson had served overseas in Afghanistan and understood better than most the importance of maintaining military dignity both in combat zones and ceremonial settings. He had already heard about the morning's incident through multiple channels: security reports, social media posts, and even a call from a local news station. "Sergeant Thompson, Corporal Chen," Lieutenant Colonel Patterson began as they stood, "at attention. I've reviewed the security footage and spoken with several witnesses about this morning's incident. I want you to know that you both handled an extremely challenging situation with exactly the kind of professionalism and restraint that reflects well on the Canadian Armed Forces." Mike felt a wave of relief wash over him. While he was confident that he and Sarah had responded appropriately, there was always some anxiety when dealing with public confrontations that might generate media attention. "Thank you, sir. We tried to balance maintaining the dignity of the ceremony with de-escalating the situation." Lieutenant Colonel Patterson nodded and gestured for them to sit down. "What's interesting is the public response. Our social media team has been monitoring the posts about today's incident, and the overwhelming reaction has been supportive of your actions and critical of the tourists' behavior. More importantly, it's generated a lot of positive discussion about the role of ceremonial duties and military service in general." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Sir, Has there been any word about whether those tourists will face any consequences? Their behavior was clearly disruptive and disrespectful. Security has their information, and they've been banned from all government. Properties for the remainder of their visit to Ottawa, the lieutenant colonel replied. More significantly, their videos have backfired completely. Instead of making the guards look foolish, they've made themselves look like exactly the kind of tourists that give visitors a bad reputation. He pulled up his computer screen and showed them some of the social media posts that had been circulating. The videos clearly showed Brad's aggressive behavior, the guards' professional responses, and the crowd's support for the military personnel. Comments ranged from praise for the guards, restraint to harsh criticism of the tourists' disrespect. One thing I want you both to understand, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson continued, is that incidents like this are actually valuable teaching moments, both for the public and for our own personnel. You demonstrated that it's possible to be firm without being excessive, proud without being arrogant, and professional under pressure. Mike reflected on the morning's events. Sir, what struck me most was how the other visitors rallied around us. It reminded me why we do this job, not just to honor military traditions, but to connect with the Canadian public. That's exactly right, Sergeant. And that brings me to why I called you in here. CBC News has requested an interview about today's incident and about ceremonial duties in general. They want to use this as an opportunity to educate people about the role of the ceremonial guard and what it means to serve in this capacity. Sarah raised her eyebrows. Are we authorized to speak to the media about what happened? Public Affairs has cleared it, and I think it would be beneficial. The story is already out there, but this would give us a chance to control the narrative and use it as an educational opportunity. Would you both be willing to participate? Both guards agreed, understanding that this could help turn a negative incident into something positive for the military and for public understanding of their role. 2 hours later, Mike and Sarah found themselves sitting across from Jennifer Walsh, a veteran CBC journalist who had covered military affairs for over a decade. The interview was being conducted in a conference room at National Defense Headquarters, with their dress uniforms providing a formal backdrop for the discussion. Let me start by asking you both to describe what happened this morning from your perspective, Jennifer began, her tone professional but friendly. Mike spoke first, choosing his words carefully. We were conducting our normal ceremonial duties when a group of tourists became disruptive. One individual in particular crossed the barriers, made disrespectful comments about the ceremony and our service, and attempted to touch my uniform for what appeared to be a social media video. How did you decide how to respond? Jennifer asked. Sarah answered this time. Our training emphasizes de-escalation whenever possible, but we also have a responsibility to maintain the dignity of the ceremony. When someone disrespects a military ceremony, they're disrespecting all Canadian service members, including those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We tried to educate rather than simply punish. Jennifer nodded and consulted her notes. I've seen the social media videos, and what's striking is how the other visitors supported you. What did that mean to you personally? Mike thought for a moment before responding. It reminded us that most Canadians understand and appreciate what military service represents. When people see disrespectful behavior toward military personnel or ceremonies, they instinctively understand that it's wrong, even if they can't always articulate why. Can you help our viewers understand why ceremonial duties matter? Some people might wonder if this is just pageantry or if there's deeper significance, Jennifer asked. Sarah leaned forward, her passion for the subject evident in her voice. Every time we stand ceremonial guard, we're representing not just ourselves, but every Canadian who has ever served. We're creating a visible connection between the military and the public, and we're honoring the memory of those who died in service to their country. It's not pageantry, it's remembrance and education combined. Jennifer asked several more questions about their backgrounds, their training, and the challenges of serving in a role that required both military precision and public interaction. As the interview concluded, she posed one final question. What would you want people to take away from today's incident? Mike and Sarah exchanged glances before Mike responded. That military service is something to be respected, that Canadian values include treating others with dignity, and that most people, both Canadians and visitors, understand and appreciate those values. Today's incident was unfortunate, but the response from the public reminded us why we're proud to serve. After the interview, as they were changing out of their dress uniforms, Sarah reflected on the day's events. You know, Mike, when I joined the ceremonial guard, I thought the biggest challenge would be standing still for hours at a time. I never expected to become an educator and diplomat. Mike laughed as he hung up his tunic. That's the thing about military service. You never know what skills you're going to need or what situations you're going to face. Today we were soldiers, diplomats, teachers, and public relations specialists all rolled into one. As they prepared to head home, both guards felt a renewed sense of purpose in their role. What had started as a confrontation with disrespectful tourists had reminded them of the broader significance of their service and the support they had from the Canadian public. 3 days after the incident, Mike was surprised to find a stack of letters waiting for him when he arrived at work. The base mail clerk, Corporal Williams, was grinning as he handed over the bundle. Sergeant, these started arriving yesterday. Word got out about what happened over the weekend, and people are writing in to express their support. Mike flipped through the envelopes, noting return addresses from all across Canada, Vancouver, Toronto, Halifax, Winnipeg, and dozens of smaller towns he had never heard of. Some were handwritten in careful cursive on formal stationery. Others were typed on computer paper, and a few were written in the distinctive, shaky handwriting of elderly writers. Sarah arrived a few minutes later to find Mike reading one of the letters with a smile on his face. Good news? She asked, noticing the pile of correspondence on his desk. Listen to this one, Mike said, holding up a letter written on pale blue stationery. It's from an 87-year-old woman in Saskatoon. Dear Sergeant Thompson and Corporal Chen, I watched the video of your encounter with those rude young men, and I wanted you to know that you made this old lady very proud. My late husband served in the Navy during World War II, and he would have been impressed by your professionalism and dignity. Thank you for showing the world what Canadian soldiers are made of. Sarah sat down at her own desk and picked up several letters addressed to her. Opening the first one, she found a letter from a high school class in New Brunswick. This one's from a grade 11 history class. Their teacher had them write letters as part of a unit on Canadian military history. Listen to this. Dear Corporal Chen, we studied the incident at Rideau Hall in our Canadian history class. Our teacher used your response to those tourists as an example of how to handle conflict with dignity and respect. You showed us that being strong doesn't mean being aggressive, and that defending your values doesn't require losing your temper. Over the next hour, they opened and read through dozens of letters. There were notes from veterans who remembered similar incidents from their own service, from parents who wanted their children to understand the importance of respecting military personnel, and from immigrants who wrote about how the Guards' professionalism reinforced their decision to become Canadian citizens. One letter particularly moved Mike. It was from a teenage boy in Alberta whose older brother was currently deployed overseas. My brother Jake is serving in Latvia with NATO, and when I saw how those tourists treated you, I got really angry. But then I saw how professional you stayed, and I realized that's what real soldiers do. They stay calm and do their job even when people are being jerks. I'm thinking about joining the military when I graduate, and I hope I can be as professional as you were if I ever face a situation like that. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson stopped by their office around noon, carrying his own stack of correspondence. I see you've been getting some fan mail, he said with a smile. We've received over 200 letters and emails at the unit level, plus countless social media messages. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Sarah looked up from the letter she was reading. Sir, this is incredible. I had no idea that incident would resonate with so many people. What's interesting, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson continued, is that we're hearing from people who had never really thought about ceremonial duties before. The incident sparked conversations about military service, respect for traditions, and Canadian values. In a strange way, those disruptive tourists did us a favor by giving us a platform to educate the public. Mike nodded thoughtfully. Sir, some of these letters are from young people who are now interested in military service. Should we be prepared to handle recruitment inquiries? Actually, that brings me to another piece of news. The recruitment office has reported a noticeable uptick in inquiries since the story broke. Nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest that your professional handling of the situation has inspired some young Canadians to consider military service. That afternoon, Mike and Sarah were asked to visit a local elementary school where a teacher had used the incident as part of a lesson on conflict resolution and standing up for your beliefs. The teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had shown the videos to her grade 5 class and led a discussion about how to handle difficult situations with dignity. When the guards arrived in their dress uniforms, the children were clearly excited, but also respectful. Mrs. Rodriguez had obviously prepared them well for the visit. One student, a girl named Emma with pigtails and glasses, raised her hand immediately. "Why didn't you get angry when those men were being mean to you?" Emma asked. Mike knelt down so he was at her eye level. "That's a great question, Emma. When someone is disrespectful, it's natural to feel angry. But part of being a soldier is learning to control those feelings and respond in a way that makes the situation better, not worse. Getting angry would have made things worse for everyone." Another student, a boy named David, asked, "Were you scared when they got close to you?" Sarah answered this one. "David, every soldier feels scared sometimes, but we train hard so that even when we're scared or angry, we can still do our job properly. The most important thing is not whether you feel scared, but how you act even when you are scared." The questions continued for over an hour, covering everything from military training to the history of the ceremonial guard to what it means to serve your country. Mrs. Rodriguez later told them that the students had been talking about the visit all week, and several had asked their parents about military service as a career option. As they drove back to base, Sarah reflected on the week's events. "Mike, when I joined the ceremonial guard, I thought I was signing up for a pretty routine assignment. Stand at attention, march in ceremonies, represent the military at public events. I never expected to become a role model or a teacher." Mike nodded as he navigated through Ottawa traffic. "I think that's the thing about military service. You never know when you're going to be called on to represent something bigger than yourself." That incident could have been just a frustrating encounter with some rude tourists. Instead, it became an opportunity to show people what military values look like in action. "The letters really got to me," Sarah admitted. "Especially the ones from military families and veterans. To know that we honored their service by how we handled ourselves, that means everything." As they arrived back at National Defense Headquarters, both guards felt a renewed sense of purpose in their role. They had always understood the importance of ceremonial duties, but the past week had shown them the broader impact their service could have on public understanding and appreciation of military values. The incident with the disruptive tourists was becoming a defining moment in their careers, not because of the confrontation itself, but because of how they had responded, and how that response had resonated with people across the country. 6 months after the incident that had made them reluctant internet celebrities, Mike and Sarah found themselves preparing for what would become one of the most meaningful ceremonies of their careers. The annual Remembrance Day service at the National War Memorial was always significant, but this year felt different. The public attention from their encounter with the disruptive tourists had created an unexpected opportunity to educate Canadians about military service and sacrifice. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson had asked them to serve as the primary ceremonial guards for the November 11th service, a role that would put them front and center as thousands of veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens gathered to honor Canada's fallen soldiers. The irony was not lost on either of them. Their professional response to disrespect had earned them the honor of participating in Canada's most solemn tribute to military sacrifice. As they prepared their uniforms the night before the ceremony, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that July morning. "Mike, do you ever think about how different things might have been if we had handled that situation poorly? What if we had lost our tempers or been unprofessional?" Mike was carefully polishing his ceremonial sword, a task he had performed hundreds of times but which felt especially important tonight. "I think about it all the time. One moment of lost composure could have undermined everything we represent. Instead, it became a teaching moment for the entire country." The letters and emails had continued to arrive throughout the fall. Military. Recruitment offices across Canada had reported sustained increases in inquiries, particularly from young people who specifically mentioned seeing the video of the Guards' professional response to disrespect. Schools had invited military personnel to speak about service and values, using the incident as a starting point for discussions about character, professionalism, and standing up for principles. On the morning of November 11th, Mike and Sarah arrived at the National War Memorial before dawn. The weather was crisp and clear, with just enough wind to make the Canadian flags flutter dramatically against the pale sky. As they took their positions, both guards were acutely aware of the significance of the moment, not just for themselves, but for everyone who would participate in or witness the ceremony. The crowd began gathering early, and Mike noticed immediately that it was larger than in previous years. Families with children, elderly veterans in wheelchairs, active-duty military personnel, and ordinary citizens all came together in the shared purpose of remembrance. What struck him most was how respectful everyone was. The incident 6 months earlier seemed to have reinforced public understanding of the solemnity and importance of military ceremonies. A young family approached the memorial, and Mike recognized them from one of the many letters they had received. The father, a military veteran himself, had written about how he used their example to teach his children about honor and respect. The man caught Mike's eye and nodded respectfully, placing his hand over his heart in acknowledgement. His two young children, a boy and a girl who couldn't have been older than 8, stood perfectly still beside their parents, clearly understanding the importance of the moment. As more people arrived, Mike and Sarah began to recognize faces from the past 6 months. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, the elementary school teacher who had brought her own family to the ceremony. There was David, one of her former students, now wearing a small poppy on his winter coat. There was the journalism student from Carleton University who had interviewed them, now working as a reporter for a local newspaper and covering the ceremony professionally. At precisely 11 a.m., the ceremony began with the traditional 2 minutes of silence. As Mike stood perfectly still, his mind wandered to all the letters they had received from military families, the conversations with school children, and the renewed public appreciation for military service that had grown out of their confrontation with disrespectful tourists. In those 2 minutes of silence, he felt connected not just to the fallen soldiers being honored, but to every Canadian who understood and valued the sacrifice of military service. The silence was profound and moving. Mike could feel the weight of thousands of people united in remembrance, and he thought about how their actions 6 months earlier had contributed to this moment of national unity and respect. The disruptive tourists had unknowingly created an opportunity for the entire country to reflect on what military service meant and why it deserved respect. When the 2 minutes ended and the ceremony continued with the laying of wreaths, Mike noticed something remarkable. The crowd was not just observing passively. People were engaged, emotional, and clearly understanding the deeper meaning of what they were witnessing. Children were asking their parents quiet questions about the ceremonies. Teenagers were taking photos not for social media entertainment, but as genuine documentation of an important moment. Adults were wiping away tears as they thought about family members who had served. After the formal ceremony concluded, something unexpected happened. A line of people began forming near where Mike and Sarah were standing. Families and individuals who wanted to personally thank them for their service. This was not part of the formal proceedings, but their commanding officer nodded his approval for them to interact with the public. The first person in line was Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, the elderly woman who had laid flowers at the memorial 6 months earlier after telling them about her husband who died in World War II. She was now using a walker, but had made the trip to Ottawa specifically for Remembrance Day and specifically to see them again. "Sergeant Thompson, Corporal Chen," she said, her voice stronger than Mike remembered. "I wanted to thank you again. What you did that day in July reminded people that military service means something. My herald would have been proud of how you represented the uniform." Behind her was the teenage boy from Alberta who had written about his brother serving overseas. He was now taller and more confident-looking, wearing a Canadian flag pin on his jacket. "Sergeant Corporal, I wanted you to know that I applied to the Canadian Armed Forces last month. Your example that day helped me understand what kind of soldier I want to become." The line continued for over an hour. There were veterans who wanted to share stories about their own encounters with disrespectful civilians, parents who had used the incident to teach their children about respect and dignity, and young people who had been inspired to consider military service. Each conversation reinforced the impact that their professional response had made on Canadian society. One of the most moving encounters was with a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, but someone who had immigrated to Canada from Hong Kong 20 years earlier. He approached with his teenage daughter, both of them clearly nervous about speaking to the guards. "Corporal Chen," he said carefully, "I am Robert Chen. I became Canadian citizen 10 years ago and my daughter was born here. When I saw how you handled those rude men, I felt proud to be Canadian. You showed what Canadian values look like, strong but not aggressive, proud but not arrogant. Thank you for representing our country so well." His daughter, who appeared to be about 16, added shyly, "I'm thinking about joining the military after university. Seeing how professional you were made me realize that serving your country can be a way to live your values every day." Another memorable conversation was with a group of Indigenous veterans who had traveled from Manitoba for the ceremony. Their spokesperson, an elderly man wearing traditional regalia along with his military medals, approached the guards with dignity and respect. "Brothers," he said, using the traditional greeting between warriors, "what you did that summer day honored not just your own service, but the service of all who have worn the uniform. In our tradition, we say that a warrior's greatest victory is not in battle, but in how he represents his people when no one is watching. You represented all of us well." As the afternoon progressed and the crowds began to disperse, Mike and Sarah found themselves walking slowly back toward their vehicle, both processing the emotional weight of the day's interactions. The incident 6 months earlier had begun as a frustrating encounter with disrespectful tourists, but it had evolved into something much more significant, a reminder of the values that military service represents and the impact that individual actions can have on public understanding and appreciation. "Sarah," Mike said as they reached their car, "I keep thinking about something Lieutenant Colonel Patterson said after the original incident. He said that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in moments when you have to decide who you are and what you stand for." Sarah nodded, still thinking about the conversations they had just finished. "That day in July, we were just doing our job. We were trying to maintain the dignity of the ceremony and de-escalate a difficult situation. We had no idea it would become something that would inspire people to think differently about military service." As they drove back to base, both guards reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. A single incident of professional response to disrespect had become a catalyst for broader conversations about military values, public service, and Canadian identity. They had learned that even routine ceremonial duties could become power.